I invite you to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 18, and we'll begin there in just a moment. Matthew chapter 18. We are going to be picking up today on the series of lessons that we have looked at on the subject of justice, as Stan mentioned. We'll be concluding that series today and this morning and this evening. I want to try to make some, maybe clear comparisons, I hope, between what the world is saying about this subject and what God's Word says about the subject. Those two things are not getting closer. They're becoming more distinct all the time, I believe. And I think a lot of people, because the words sound familiar, that justice, I know that word, that's something God wants from us, and then they hear the world talk about that, and they think we're talking about the same thing. We're not. And the path that the world takes to justice very often leads in the very opposite direction. Some of the terminology along with that is the idea of social justice. Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian philosopher/economist, in 1973 wrote, "I have come to feel strongly that the greatest service I can still render to my fellow men would be that I could make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed to ever again employ the term social justice." Oh, just so. He didn't succeed, because here we are, some 50 years later nearly, and people not only using that term, they're not ashamed, but my brethren seem to be not ashamed at times to use such terminology. I think that we need some clarity, and we need clarity for another generation of young people who are being led away by siren songs of the world, and maybe some old fools who are following them. Need some regrounding about terminology and ideology. The terminology and the ideology of social justice, it rips us away from basic realities of actual justice. And like so many other false doctrines, it attempts to convince people that they can be like God. That is the very first false doctrine, and most false doctrines find their root in that notion. In this particular case, it tries to convince people that they can know all and fix all the societal ills of the world, that they can take on the characteristics of God in bringing about perfect justice. As we have already suggested in some of the previous lessons, our actual role is rather modest by comparison. And what's more, social justice has most often and will most often only lead, ironically, to greater injustice. So much of God's instruction about justice is about restraint. It's about placing limits on our folly. When we follow God's rules, we do not arrive at perfect justice here, but we keep ourselves from engaging in injustice. In many ways, that is what we are capable of. We are given boundaries to keep us from participating in what is already there, which is the injustice of the world. If we disregard these boundaries, we do so to our own peril. In the movie, or the play, A Man for All Seasons, made into a movie later, Sir Thomas More, who was a lawyer and then spiritual advisor to King Henry VIII, is depicted in this play. And particularly what's at issue is his unwillingness to justify Henry VIII's divorce and subsequent formation of the Church of England. And so that's kind of the central theme of this play. And as he is being questioned before Parliament, he would not condone, he would not confess Henry VIII as the leader of the church, and was eventually put to death for treason. And as he's being questioned, William Roper, one of the members of Parliament in that play, says, "So, now you give the devil the benefit of the law." More replied, "Yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil?" Roper replied, "Yes. I'd cut down every law in England to do that." When the devil turned around on you, where would you hide, Roper? All the laws being flat. And I think that is an absolutely just depiction of social justice as it has been practiced throughout history. Cut down all the laws to get to the end that we want. And when they're cut down, guess what? The mob turns on you. And there's nothing left to protect you. And so these rules are in place. And somebody might say, those rules keep us from getting at justice. They may. That's true. But it's justice, it keeps us from getting at justice that maybe we're incapable of getting to in the first place. And so we've got to recognize our limited capacity, as we discussed in our last lesson. Well, I want to begin this morning by talking about our limited role, determining what our role is in any particular question of justice. In the first place, I think we need to ask the question, do I have a role in the adjudication of this defense? I know I checked to make sure that this was correct before it got imported, so the font I know is a little bit fuzzy. It wasn't when I entered it, but just listen to my voice and I'll tell you what's up there. Do I have a particular role in this offense? This is an important question because so much injustice happens when people propose to enter into a situation about which they have no business. They're making it their business. They're presuming that they have a responsibility or even permission to be a participant in a situation that may not involve them whatsoever. And maybe in fact, they have a responsibility to stay out of it, much less not having permission to be involved in it. And so there may be a number of things that may open up a role for you in any particular situation. Maybe you're the one offended. Okay, you're the actual victim in a crime or a sin that has been committed. Matthew chapter 18 lays out that sort of a scenario. And so he says, beginning in verse 15, if your brother sins, and most translations, that's the New American Standard, most translations would put that, if your brother sins against you. And I think that's a fair representation of the text. And so it lays out the premise about how you go about that, showing him his sin in private, taking other witnesses with you, and eventually, if there is no satisfaction or repentance, you bring it before the entirety of the congregation. But obviously, if you've been sinned against, that you're the primary victim, then yes, you're going to have a role in that. Now, we want to be very careful because sometimes we make vicarious victims of ourselves. Someone who I like has been sinned against. And so then I imagine that it's really just the same as saying I've been sinned. Well, it's not. It's not actually the same. And so you may have to keep a little bit of distance and not personalize something that has happened to somebody that you know. You weren't witness to it. You weren't there. It didn't happen to you. And so you may be very limited on your involvement in the actual transaction of justice, the actual adjudication of justice. But maybe you're not the one chiefly offended, but you are someone who actually witnessed. Witnesses play a key part in actually figuring out what happened and figuring out who's right and who's wrong, separating the he saids and the she saids. And over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19, it lays out particularly with regards to elders that there must be witnesses, that there must be people who are willing to come forward and testify about actually what was seen, not what was heard, but what was seen. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19, he says, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. We'll talk about the 2 or 3 witnesses and the nature of those witnesses a little bit later in the lesson, but I just want to be clear about what the roles are. Do you have something to add? Now, if you come in and maybe you have general philosophy to add, we don't need that right now. There's a place for that. There's a place for those kind of conversations, but it's not in the adjudication of offenses. There are facts to be considered. Did you see something? Well, no, I didn't see anything. Then go away. What are you doing here? Well, I'm here because I want my voice to be heard, and that's what everybody wants, their voice to be heard. And we, in our society, make everybody think through all of our digital platforms that you have a right to that you deserve that. God lays out what this kind of situation looks like. There's the accuser, there is the accused, the victim and the potential perpetrator. There are witnesses to those crimes. And then finally, there are those whom all of this is brought before. There are judges who sit and who hear those cases. And the thing that we need to think about in that case is that my role? And here again, just like when people think they're witnesses when they're actually not, people think they are the offended party when they're actually not. A great many people think they are judges when they are not. So in John chapter 18, this can go two ways. Somebody can think that they're a judge when they're not. They have no business. They have no authority. They have no jurisdiction. That's not your responsibility. You don't have any authority to be hearing those facts and making decisions on those facts. You're a bystander. But it can go the other way. There are times when people actually have responsibility and won't take it on. And in John 18, we see just such a case. We see the case of Pilate, who does hear the facts of the case. He even comes to a conclusion, but he keeps his conclusion private. His responsibility was to actually say, not only do I find no fault in the man, but to proclaim it to the Jews. I do not find fault. He should have issued that decision, and he should have stood behind the authority he had to make that decision, but he was a coward. And so there are judges who will be cowards and will not judge. I think particularly among churches that it is very easy for people to come into roles of authority and positions of influence. And then when people come to them in the very manner that Paul earnestly urges us to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, to take cases before wise men among yourselves, then those wise men step back and say, I don't want to get involved. And then we wonder why the dirty laundry of the church spills out into the public, and why people would feel the need to go to judges who will actually hear them. I'm thankful that we have elders here who, when there is a grievance, are willing to hear. Now, they're going to ask you, we'll talk more about this in a minute, they're going to ask you for facts, they're going to ask you for the circumstances, they're not going to take vague accusations, but when there is actual accusations, they will hear it, they will listen, and they will get involved. And there's a lot of people that don't like that. A lot of people would rather have people who stand back and stay out of it. But when it's your job, then absolutely get involved. When it's not, then leave room for the people whose job it is. So, do I have an actual role? Maybe, though, I have a role, but is this offense actually worth pursuing? Is this something that actually needs to be played out in a court of justice, whatever that court may be? Perhaps it is the court of justice in your own home. Perhaps it's the court of justice within the church. Perhaps it's actually a civil court of law. But is it something that actually needs to be taken to that point? And I think there's some thought processes that need to go before we figure out how serious we're about to make this charge. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1, judge not, lest you be judged. One of the first things we need to think about is this something that am I approaching this the way I would want somebody to approach me under the same circumstances? And a lot of times what we do is we escalate things and we make stronger accusations than should be made in an instance when, if it were the other way around, we would be able to dream up all sorts of reasons why we're overthinking the case. We're exaggerating the seriousness of the crime. I think of this when I speak to husbands and wives, couples where the marriage has utterly deteriorated. And everything is on the level of like official accusation. Every disagreement is actual bringing of charges to the other one. I asked you to get bread on the way home and you said you would, and then you didn't. You are a liar. No. He's a man. And there's some frailties and issues with that, But there's no vindictiveness. There's no crime has been committed against you. What's needed here is a conversation. We need to calm down a little bit. But everything goes there. And I've listened to those testimonies of wives and husbands back and forth where they're describing. Amy and I were listening on one occasion, and it was very similar from the standpoint of, here's what my husband, now what kind of father does that? And Amy was like, literally all of them. But in her mind, it was way up here. And he was no longer fit to be called a father because he acted literally like all. That's, the ideal, but there should be some patience. And so we need to think in those kind of terms. When somebody says something, and there's a couple of different ways that we could take that. Do we take it in the worst possible way? Or do we give benefit of the doubt where it is due? And so we start there. Are we really ready to charge somebody with a crime, a sin? Or is this just something, a matter of judgment, something that deserves patience, some long suffering? And we need to be very discerning and very, very careful about that. Is it an actual offense or just hurt feelings? Is it something that you don't like, but upon further reflection, there's actually no facts. There's actually nothing that you could indeed convict someone of. In 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and especially as we get into 2nd Corinthians, we see the inference that the people in Corinth had a lot of things against Paul. That those charges seem to be mounting as we read along from 1 Corinthians into 2 Corinthians. They got a lot of problems with Paul, to the point that he finds it necessary to make a defense that he wished he didn't have to make. And as we look at that, one of the passages that strikes me in all of that is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and beginning in verse 11, where Paul points out to the Corinthians that the issues there, the closeness, the distance that is being created, has nothing to do with Paul's behavior, and in fact, everything to do with their behavior. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 11, our mouth has spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is opened wide. You are not restrained by us, but you're restrained in your own affections. Now, in a like exchange, I speak as to children. Open wide to us also. A lot of times when people start with grievances, if we really get all the facts out onto the table, really think it through, we're a part of the problem. But rarely do people think that they are a part of the problem. And it's much more common to figure out how the other person has all the work to do and how I have none. And so we need to be very careful when we're about to bring charges. Make sure that I don't have the beam in my own eye, that I'm not going around being a mote inspector and a beam ignorer. I also think that there's a difference between a conversation and a prosecution. Official accusations being made versus, hey, here's some things I'd like to talk to you about. I think we see that, I think we see that range in the book of 1 Corinthians. I think there's some things where Paul brings accusations. 1 Corinthians 5 is very official. Here's what a man is doing. Here's what that means. Here's what you ought to do about it, right? There's procedure. But then there's other elements, and 2 Corinthians chapter 6 would indicate that, where we're not talking about official charges. We're just saying, hey, there's a problem here. Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation about the problem. I think there's a problem when we get those confused in either direction. There was an occasion where I was preaching at a congregation, and there was a man who had a hard time getting along with people. He was rude in many ways and challenging, and was making it where people didn't want to teach class because he would the way that he would address people was just so very unfair. Well, I just asked him. I said, "Could we sit down and talk?" And he said, "Yeah." And so I kind of walked him through what my concerns were. And I said, here are some of the things that people are upset by. I'll go with you to talk to them if you like, but I just feel like if we could shift. I mean, I love you and I want you to be a part of this group. And he stopped me. He said, I want to know, are you officially bringing charges against me? I was like, what just happened here? I thought we were just, I said, literally, this is the problem. I'm just trying to have a conversation with you. And you're trying to make this into a courtroom scene. Now, on the contrary, sometimes it escalates to the point where, it needs to look a lot like a courtroom scene. And then there's people that say, no, let's not go there. Let's keep it on the conversational level. We got to know the difference. And we got to know when it's time to cross that line. And we need to be clear about when we're crossing that line. There's a difference between husbands and wives talking to each other and working through the differences and the conflicts that come across all along in a marriage, and the point where a spouse is ready to put her spouse away. And those are very different conversations. And so we need to figure out if that's where we want to go, if that's where we need to go. And then we also need to figure out whether or not we have enough facts or witnesses to proceed. This is a difficult problem, and it goes to our limitations. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 5, there is explicit language that the New Testament draws on. This is the context of the 2 or 3 witnesses that we see often referenced in the New Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15, it says, a single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. I think when we go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19, again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next section. But the emphasis there, I think as we get to 1 Timothy 5:19, it's not Paul saying that, against elders and elders alone you need 2 or 3 witnesses. You can railroad anybody else with 1 witness. But I think it's Paul doing what we see in the qualifications of elders, which is to say that when we look at those qualifications, there are some of them, many of them in fact, that really any Christian needs if he wants to be a Christian. But he's saying you be particularly careful that these qualities are there if you're about to make a man an elder. And I think that the same thing, that this is a principle that goes all the way across the board, no matter who we're talking about, no matter who's been accused. We don't just accept weak testimony. We don't accept singular testimony, but rather we pursue multiple witnesses. And in the case of an elder, he's just saying, you better not do it in the case of an elder. Baseline. I think in addition, maybe you've got some evidence, but it's not enough evidence to draw any firm conclusions. It's enough evidence to speculate, but not enough evidence to convict. And I think sometimes we're really frustrated when, because of the amount of evidence that is there, we feel very certain, but we can't make the case. And so we have to walk away when we're pretty sure somebody's guilty. Well, if you don't have any more evidence, there's not anything else you can do about it. You say, well, God knows he's guilty. Exactly. God does know if he's guilty or not. And he'll be the one to render judgment in those cases, because your abilities have stopped at what you are able to know. I think we often imagine we have vital roles in the playing out of justice in any particular instance, when in fact, so very often, it is not our business, and that we ought to keep our mouths shut. In 2 Samuel, chapter 16, as David is in one of the lowest moments of his career as king, he is reaping the rewards, the consequences of his sin with Bathsheba, as it was prophesied. And he is on his way out of Jerusalem, and up comes the man Shimei. And Shimei inserts himself into the case, and he speaks out. He says, "Get out. Get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, and in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. And behold, you are taken in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed." Now, David is reaping some rewards of his behavior, but it's not what Shimei thinks. At a distance, Shimei, with his own biases, comes and says, "I know what the problem is here, and I know what's happening here, and you don't know anything, Shimei." And the assessment of David's mighty men is not far off. We'll come back to Shimei a little bit later, because I think he presents us with some interesting thoughts about the subject of justice. Now, he may be someone who could sit over there to the side and think wrong thoughts. But what he does is he makes himself truly guilty by entering into the arena and spilling those thoughts out for the world. And he himself becomes guilty and part of the injustice that is going on, even when David is deserving of some justice. And David himself admits that and accepts that. But not this. Who are you? You don't have any part in this. Just be quiet and let what happens, the people that are supposed to be involved with what happens, play that out in the way that it ought to play out. Well, thinking about the proceedings, how should that courtroom scene play out? What should it look like? Well, I want to begin by talking about the nature of those witnesses. Going back to Deuteronomy chapter 19, we've already noted that it should be multiple witnesses. Now, this right here is already a difficulty for us, because for us, I think that in many cases, we would feel like one witness should be enough. But as I say, the language is emphatic. And not only should there be more than one witness, but he goes on to talk about how those witnesses should interact in the adjudication of the case. Beginning in verse 17, it says, "Then both men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly. And if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." The idea of witnesses, first of all, there is the element here that they can't be anonymous. I know some people who said, doesn't cut it. Who are they? I want to be able to stand before my accusers. Who is it that's accusing me? Now your mind already might be going to, well, what about something like witness intimidation? I realize that's a thing. And I realize that it might be very intimidating as a witness to have to come and publicly accuse someone who is dangerous. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to have to live with the consequence that we can't do anything about him without your testimony. And God says your testimony must stand questioning. And so, again, it's not just vague charges floating out there in the blogosphere, but there's a body with a name, the one that his mama gave him. Not a pseudonym, not a screen name. Somebody who's willing to stand up in court and answer questions. And you say, do you know how painful that would be? I can't imagine. But it's the only path to justice. You watch depictions, you watch crime dramas, and you see that played out. And you see the police officers who are pleading with the witness, and they're saying, but I'm scared. And the police officer saying, I know. But we just can't say we heard somebody say this and then put the man in jail. You're going to have to stand up and you're going to have to be questioned, and it may get very uncomfortable. But if you want this man to answer for what he's done, then you got to put your testimony out there. That's biblical. That's not American justice system. That's biblical justice system. And I think sometimes we want to protect the innocent so badly. It's a valid concern. We want to protect them so badly that we would cut down God's laws in order to do it. And we better be careful, because one day you may be the one accused who doesn't get to know who's accusing you. And slander may be spread about you or your son or your husband, and you don't get to stand up in court, and you made the rules. You said it was fine to not be able to face your accuser until the accuser is accusing you. And then you'd like those rules to be back in place. Well, that goes all the way back to the beginning. You don't get to have justice that goes one way but not the other. Either those rules are sacrosanct, they're God's rules, and they ought to be held in place. Or if they're thrown out, then they get thrown out for everybody. And so they protect us all. Again, no single witnesses without corroboration, as we reference 1 Timothy chapter 5. I think that repetition of that, it must be eyewitness testimony, not hearsay. That is in the very definition of the word witness, right? It's not, I heard somebody who said this. You know, sometimes the multiple witness checkbox is met because someone says, this is what I saw, and then somebody else comes along and says, yep, I heard them say that that's what they saw. Well, no. That'll make you a witness. And so while we may sympathize, we need to understand those limitations. I can imagine situations where somebody is victimized by crime and they are afraid to talk about it. And they wait 30 years to say something about what they've suffered. And then after those 30 years, they decide to talk about what they've suffered. And now there's no evidence and there's no corroboration. And our sense of justice, if it's overexercised or misinformed, what we may think is, even though there's no evidence and even though there's no corroboration and we've only got one witness, why we've got to prosecute. I'm sorry, but that ship may have sailed. There's not a statute of limitations on the crime, but there is an expiration date sometimes on evidence. And if we've moved past that, it's not that I don't care about what happened to you. It's that I care about whether we can prove it. And we can't just take your word for it. And so that's the premise that the Bible lays out, corroboration. Other witnesses, other evidence. Can you prove what you're saying? Enough evidence to tell a story is not the same as enough evidence to prove a story. I think this is very important. Because in so many of the cases in which we get involved that really we have no business in, we see a few snippets of evidence and then we draw conclusions, and usually they're conclusions by people who gave us that evidence while filling in the gaps where there was not evidences. So what can happen is I can have a few pieces of information, and the question about whether those pieces of information are fact or not is not what's at question. What's at question is what those facts mean. And I can tell you a story wherein all those facts fit within the story, but not have proven the story just yet. I can prove correlation, but maybe not causation, as the saying goes. You know, when we were in school, I don't know if they still do this, but when we were in school, our teacher would give us a list of vocabulary words. And she would say, write a story with including all of these vocabulary words. And so we'd all write our stories. And provided our desks were far enough apart, they didn't look the same. And people wrote all different stories, all using a long list of the same words. And the question is not, was that word actually in there? Or was it used in the appropriate way? It wasn't always, in fact, but was the word in there? The question is, do those words by themselves lead you to any conclusions? And of course they didn't. It was just a list of words. And sometimes we have some facts. And you could make a story out of those facts, and then you could make a very opposite story out of those facts. Let's say someone says, I got this example from a guy I was writing on the subject. He said, let's say that someone says, Stephen came outside yesterday and shot our dog. And it was because he got 3 feet over onto his property line. And somebody says, did you shoot their dog? Yes, in fact, I did shoot their dog. Was he 3 feet onto your property line? Yes, he was, in fact, 3 feet onto my property line. Case closed. I said, whoa. Let me add that Rylant had walked outside, and this dog had him by the throat. And I could not get him loose, and I shot the dog. Does that make any difference? Or is it just, hey, Stephen's the dog killer? And I think that happens a whole lot. That we present a few facts, we draw conclusions, and then we think, I'm just going by the facts. Are you disputing the facts? Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just disputing your conclusion from those facts. Joshua chapter 9. In Joshua chapter 9 is a good example of having facts and a story to go along with them. The Gibeonites, you remember, they come with a story and with evidence to prove their story, right? It says they took wineskins worn out, torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provisions was dry and had become crumbled. And so they bring all of that, and they add it to their testimony in verse 11. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go and meet them and say, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. Look, this is our bread. It was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our houses on the day when we left to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and has become crumbled. These wineskins which were filled were new, and behold, they are torn. And these our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of the very long journey. Now, does anybody dispute that the bread is dry and crumbled? That the sandals are worn out? That the clothes are torn? No, it's all there. Proof. It's all a lie. And they use proof to tell the story they wanted to tell. And people do that. And the people who report the stories do that. Because they come in already believing something about the people involved. And whether they even know it or not, people would like certain people to be guilty and other people to be innocent. And they would like the facts to prove that. And so if it's possible to take those facts and come to the conclusion they already want to come to, they very likely are going to get there. Motives can play a role, but they must be proved. It's important, people's motives, about why they did something. In some cases, not in all cases. Sometimes there are cases where we can't quite figure out why somebody blew up one day and decided to walk into a public place and start shooting people. And we don't get to the bottom of it. And really, frankly, no motive makes it okay. And so there are some cases where the motive would be instructive and helpful, but maybe we're not able to get at it, and that's all right. There are other cases where the motive is the difference between guilt and innocence. So in Joshua chapter 22, when we have this case of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh building the altar on the eastern side of the Jordan River, And the prosecution, the accusers come, that is the whole rest of the nation of Israel with swords drawn. And the difference between war and peace is that they say, that's not what we meant by this. And so because of a distinction of we're building this altar for this reason, to worship God in a way he has not commanded, versus we're building the altar for this reason, only to make remembrance for all of us about who we are. It's the difference between war and peace. And so it is sometimes in crimes, that motive makes a difference. But it must be proved. It must be proved particularly on the side of guilt. Maybe Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh really are harboring a notion that they are going to worship God in a false way one day. Well, there's no proof of that yet. And all we can do is rely on their testimony. Now, they throw up an animal on that altar and start burning incense. Now the game has changed. And they could say, oh, that's still not what we're intended. Yeah, but you're doing it. But until there's proof, we don't convict. We don't say, oh, but you should have seen the way he looked at me. That is not evidence. That is speculation. And incidentally, people see looks based on their own hearts just as much as the heart of the other person. They hear tones based on where they are in a certain place and time just as much as where the other person is. And you can go and listen to a conversation and 3 people will have heard it differently. The question is there evidence to prove the motive is there that you think is there? Have they said something that reveals that motive? Have they actually done something that has revealed that motive? Or is it just when you know, you know? That's not allowed. Motive is involved. Motive is a part of the case. But when you go start assigning motives where you do not have evidence, then you are a participant in injustice. Character also matters, both good character and bad character. In the case of Moses in Numbers chapter 12, when his brother and sister have risen up and begun to accuse him of really grasping for power, one of the things that strikes me is that God's defense is to point at who Moses is and what his relationship with Moses is. Beginning in verse 6 of Numbers chapter 12, he essentially says, do you not know who Moses is? He says, hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? Now look, if Moses is guilty, by all means. But I think what God is saying here is, you should have been extra careful when you thought to start making charges against this guy. I think that's what Paul's saying. You don't just flippantly start saying things about elders. You want to be extra careful. Do you understand the role that they have? You don't just start throwing things out there and see if they stick, which is a modern aspect of justice. You make sure. And hear what these people have, what Aaron and Miriam have, are unfounded, unjustified accusations based more on their own envy than anything Moses has done. In fact, he's the very opposite of what they portray him to be. And they end up being more like what they say about him than he himself is. And so God points to that character. And that character ought to mean something. Over in 1 Kings chapter 2, coming back to Shimei now, a little bit later in the story. In 1 Kings chapter 2, David has left Solomon with charges to tie up loose ends. There are a number of men who have not met with justice as yet. And David charges Solomon to see to it that they do. in due time. And some of them meet it rather swiftly, and some of them meet it slowly. But in the case of Shimei, we're told beginning in verse 36, that the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, "Build for yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, and do not go out from there to any place. For on the day you go out and cross over the brook Kidron, you will know for certain that you shall surely die. Your blood shall be on your own head." Shimei then said to the king, "The word is good. And as my lord the king has said, so shall your servant do, or so your servant will do." So Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days. Now you may know the story. Shimei has some servants run away, and he assumes that this is reasonable provocation to break his word to the king, and so he leaves and goes to Gath to recover his servants. He comes back, and when he does, Solomon says, I told you what would happen, and now it will. And he loses his life because he did not keep the king's command. Now, is Solomon's command a just command? Well, if it's just random citizen, then no, it certainly is not. It's not okay to just go around and say, hey, your freedoms are gone. You don't get to leave Jerusalem anymore. But this isn't just any man. This is Shimei. This is Shimei who heaped scorn on the king, who thought that it was his place to add to the misery of the king as he was being overthrown by his beloved son. And so his character, his past behavior is why the king comes in and says, these are the rules now. When you behave in certain ways, restrictions come along with that. And guess what? You continue in that behavior and the leash tightens. And I think some people have this notion of justice that no matter what you do, that at every turn, the slate gets wiped clean, and we pretend that your character is a blank slate, not worthy to be considered. It's inadmissible. And the jails are full of people who are certain that they've done nothing wrong and that it's everybody else's fault. And the system is just against them. It's a joke in jail. What are you in for? I didn't do it, like everybody else in here. There are very few people who, when they commit injustices, are willing fully to grasp hold of the consequences of that injustice, and who understand that their character has been ruined, their testimony has been ruined, they are not capable of being worthy witnesses anymore. And more corroboration is going to be needed if we're going to trust them. These are consequences. We make ourselves people of low character, then we're going to be treated as people who don't have as much trust. I've been through that. I've squandered and I've ruined my character with people where they do not trust me, and I've appealed and been given opportunities, yes, to rebuild the trust. But I was forthrightly told, you don't have it right now. And here are the consequences. Here are the losses of the freedoms. And I'll tell you, frankly, there are people who still don't trust me because of things they witnessed when I was a teenager. I accept that. I'm the one who did that. And I do not demand that they trust me because I am the one who squandered it. I believe that I have worked to rebuild trust and to build a character and a good reputation. But I'll still take responsibility if to my dying day that man does not trust me. That's mine to own. And it is not mine to go around and say, you have no right to bring up those things anymore. All of this takes some time to play out. In Joshua chapter 7 and verse 16 through 18, we have a very neat and quick way to arrive at justice. Achan has sinned, and we find Joshua going through a very quick process of gathering together all the people, narrowing it down to a tribe, to a family, to a certain person within that family, and finally Achan. And it all happens right there in 3 verses. Yes, God is guiding that process. We're going to take a little bit more time. We start with all the people, and we narrow it down, and that right there takes some time. Then we narrow it down a little bit further. And we consider the evidence, we consider the witnesses. And justice, while in a relative sense ought to be swift, when it is too swift, often guarantees injustice. And swiftness is what we crave. And so when a crime is committed and when it is made public, we want it and we want it now. And what we do is we so often join the mob that is least likely to end up at the place of actual truth. Judges and juries should not make decisions on gut feelings. They should not walk in and say, I have a hunch that this fellow's guilty. In John chapter 7, we have Nicodemus among those who would persecute and prosecute Jesus. It says, beginning in verse 48, no one of the rulers or Pharisees has believed him, has he? But this crowd which does not know the law is accursed. Nicodemus, he who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, our law does not judge a man unless it first hears him and know what he is doing, does it? They answered him, you are not also from Galilee, are you? Search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee. There's some solid evidence. We just don't like him. We don't like where he's from, and we don't have to talk to him. And we don't have to go through the normal rules of evidence, and we don't have to go through a trial because we already know what the outcome is. That's what crowds of people have always said when they're railroading someone to the noose. And it doesn't change if that crowd is espousing pain that you sympathize with or pain that you do not sympathize with. It's unjust either way. And so we restrain ourselves. And we go through a process, a proceeding, and we limit ourselves by those rules. And when we get to the end of it, if we are not fully satisfied and we are not certain that justice is played out, but we have followed the procedures, then we comfort ourselves not by adding more rules or breaking these rules. We comfort ourselves knowing that the perfect judge is still in session. He's on his bench. And whatever is true in this case will out. It will most certainly be known, even if it is never known to us. And we must be satisfied. And we must be comforted by that truth instead of joining the grievance mongers out there who think that you can find justice if you're just willing to go beyond the rules. If you're just willing to set them aside, at least in this case. No, not ever. Because if we tear down the rules, then we have torn them down for ourselves also. And I can't afford that. And I don't believe you can either. Well, maybe you're one here who thinks in terms of, who dwells on the unfairness of this world. And maybe your mind goes to wanting to see some shift and some change among people that would all of a sudden make the earth be something it literally has never been since Eden. And you think that's just around the corner. In some ways, it is. But it's not around the corner that the world's telling you it's around. Around that door is more of the same. Just change the order, right? It's not around that corner we'll find that there is no injustice. No, it's just different people committing injustice. We just put different people in charge. But around this corner, God says, I am there. I'm the only place, He's the only place that you will ever be certain that what is just is what will happen. And you could find comfort there this morning, surrendering to the one who will do right. And if there's anyone who might find comfort in that message, be willing to submit to Him this morning. We would help you in any way that we could. If you'll come forward while we stand and while we